Well, hey everybody, hope you are doing well. This is episode or podcast 2 of Heart of a Shepherd. Last week we looked at kind of the introduction and the six temptations. This week we are looking at the first antidote to the temptation, which is serving sacrificially. Now, Dad, if I think we've grown up in the church, like for those who have gone to church, this is pretty familiar. I mean, Pastor often teaches this, feels like every other week, and we're looking at John 13 about Jesus washing feet. And I think for me and for others, I think we can feel like we do this pretty well. Why are we talking about this? What would you say to something like that?
Well, yeah, I empathize with that. Like you said, if you've grown up in the church, you've heard this passage a million times. Even as I write this curriculum, there's a side of it that goes, we're starting with serving sacrificially. Really? Can't we start with something new? Can't we start with something interesting? Um, but the reality is it's essential that we start with this, and one of the reasons for that is, although we've heard this a million times, we've read the passage so many times, the truth is we look around at the evidence and the evidence tells us we don't get it. So every time we turn around, there's Christian leaders that are falling, that are failing, they're puffed up with pride. There's Christian businessmen and businesswomen that are full of themselves, full of their wealth. There's Christian activists, those who feel like they're holding the moral high ground on some issue, whatever end of the political spectrum, whatever side of the aisle it is, but all too often holding that moral high ground, not with love and grace, but with pride and superiority. And there's just something deep inside of us that turns to this idolatry of power and glory. And a sacrificial service is the antidote to pride
Mm.
that Jesus gives us. And so, therefore, where there's pride, there won't be sacrificial service. Where there's sacrificial service, it starts to beat back pride. But of course, it's not just an out there problem, is it? I mean, this is something that I struggle with. I've been literally studying this passage all week, thinking about this podcast, while I fail at it every day. We just moved houses recently. I'm tired. I've been burning the candle at both ends. There's boxes everywhere. There's DIY projects everywhere. We're renovating. We bought a fixer upper. There's so much to do. And I wake up every morning going, I'm going to serve my family today. I'm going to serve my kids today. I'm going to serve my wife today. And by the time 5 p.m. hits, my heart's in a completely different place. And I'm going, why isn't so and so helping? And why am I having to do everything? And nobody appreciates me. We struggle with this because that idolatry of power and glory, that idolatry of wanting to be somebody, of wanting to be treated in a certain way, of wanting to be seen in a certain way, runs deep in us. And so I think there's a reason that Jesus goes after this.
Well, can you expand and tell us why serving sacrificially is specifically so important?
Yeah, well, I mean, part of it is the standard isn't serving. The
Mm.
standard here is serving our enemies, and that's a whole different level for us to reach for. So notice the context here in John chapter 13. If you're there, feel free to join us. John chapter 13, verse 2, right out of the jump. The evening meal was being served, and the devil had already prompted Judas Iscariot, son of Simon, to betray Jesus. And if you pay attention to this passage, there's no mention of any disciple here except for Judas and Peter. Well, why are those the two that John emphasizes? Because Jesus is serving his enemies in this moment. Judas is the one that's going to betray him. Jesus talks about that in John 13. Peter will deny him 3 times. Jesus talks about that in John 13. The two men who are going to turn their backs on Jesus in the moment of his greatest need, those are the two that Jesus sits down and serves. And so the standard isn't serving, the standard is serving our enemies, and that's a whole different ballpark.
I mean, two things there. Firstly, serving sacrificially. When we think of something, we think of a sacrifice. We think of something that it costs us, and
It hurts.
it really hurts. And that's what Jesus asks us to do. It's easy to serve the person that serves you first. It's hard to serve the person that doesn't serve you. And then second, I think it's really interesting that Jesus starts with serving.
Yes.
Like he could be talking about leadership or how to grow the church, but he starts with serving.
Yeah, these are his final hours. And these are his final words. He could have talked about anything. And before he even starts talking, he just gets down, puts on a towel, and starts to wash feet. And this is so important for these disciples because these disciples have already shown that they have this desire for power and fame. Seems like every time we turn around, Jesus is having to sit them down because they're having some argument about who's the greatest. And of course, James and John and their mom have been trying to arrange for them to get the seats of power in Jesus's coming kingdom. And the problem is they will become great. These men are going to lead a church that becomes the first mega church. We figure a decade into the book of Acts, there's probably 30,000 members in the church in Jerusalem, and they're at the front of it. They experience incredible miracles and power. You know, Peter and John help a crippled man walk. Peter has so much power flowing through him that they're taking his handkerchief and just touching people with it. And I've often wondered, how did they handle that sort of power? How did they handle that sort of authority? And part of it is, of course, they both have just high definition failure in the rearview mirror that keeps them humble. Peter with his denials of Christ, but part of it is they've seen Jesus's example here, and they've grasped the model of serving sacrificially. And we have those same temptations, don't we? And so Jesus, before he does any teaching, before he does anything else, he says, "Let me tell you what it's really about." And he puts on the towel.
Well, we're all pretty familiar with the story. We know how it goes, but can you unpack it for us and tell us why it's so remarkable?
Yeah, you know the story, but let's make sure we've got it in our mind. So they're at a meal, and of course, they didn't eat meals then like we do today with tables and chairs. They're laying on the ground on their side, reclined on pillows. It's kind of star formation, head towards the middle of the table, feet out, which means that you've got somebody's feet somewhere near your head. And this is a walking culture. So these are sandals, not shoes. It's dirt, not pavement. It's animals and poop, not cars. And so their feet are dirty. They haven't showered for a while. They're smelly. They're probably manure encrusted. This is dirty work. And you've heard it a million times. This is slave work. But even more than that, Jesus has every reason not to serve in this moment. He's about to go to the cross. He's about to be whipped. He's about to be separated from his Father. He's about to sweat drops of blood because he's under so much stress. And the man who's going to betray him, the man who's going to cause all of that, is in the room. His best friend, Peter, or one of his three best friends, is going to deny him three times. If there's any reason not to serve, it's in this moment. I mean, if I'm Jesus here, I'm hiding in a closet. I'm trying to figure it out. I'm getting my game face on. And instead, he's with his leaders and he's serving them. This is incredible.
Yeah, I mean, I think of my life, and when I have to take out the garbage in the morning or do something, my first reaction is I could be doing something else. And frankly, there's a side where it's like, I feel like anybody else in the house could be doing this. Like, I've got more important things to do. I've got to advance my athletic abilities or work on my music or something like that. But ultimately, that is a pretty selfish approach to that. What would you say to something like that?
Yeah, I mean, we all struggle with this, don't we? I'm too tired. I wouldn't say it out loud, but I'm too important. I'm too busy. Somebody else could do this. I've already served enough. And of course, Jesus just blows all those excuses out of the water. And I think what this means for us that's really clear from this passage is, well, let me tell you what it doesn't mean. You know, first of all, I think we have to be careful that we don't play the martyr.
Mm.
I'm guilty of this. I serve and then I hold it over people's heads. I serve and then I want to be praised for it. And if nobody notices, I go quiet, or I'm
Mm.
looking for that praise. I'm wanting everybody to notice, and that's not serving. That's not what we see Jesus
Mm.
do here. And he quietly gets up, wraps a towel, and just goes at it. There's no, if no one else is going to do it, I'll do it. He just gets after it. So, first of all, I think it's really important we don't play the martyr.
That's so true. What's the second thing?
Second one is it's important that we don't grow out of serving. So we have this tendency as we grow up the org chart, or we grow up the family ladder, or we grow up in age, that we start to think we're too old, or we're too senior, or we're too important, or we're just too busy to serve. And this is how our whole world is functioned. Servants serve kings, children serve parents, and obviously vice versa as well. Down the org chart serves up the org chart. And it's so important that we don't grow out of serving.
That's interesting. And I think also as we grow out of it, I think sometimes we substitute certain things with serving. Can you give some examples for that?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is the third thing that I think we want to avoid. You're so right. Is we sometimes say that we're serving, and we are, but we're not serving in the way Jesus is talking about here. So you'll often hear leaders or teachers say, "Well, I serve by leading, or I serve by teaching." And of course, that's absolutely true. I'm a leader, I'm a teacher. Leadership is gut level hard work. Teaching takes so much preparation. It is serving. It's genuinely serving if you do it the right way, to lead and to teach. But it's not this type of serving. At some level, leadership has its own reward built in. At some level, teaching has its own reward built in. But this sort of serving is a completely different type of serving. It's the serving that gets you no thanks. It's just dirty. It's grimy. It's show up early, stay late, in the background type of serving. And I think far too many leaders get rid of this type of serving in the name of efficiency,
Mm.
in the name of I've got an organization to run, only do what only you can do. We have all of these different leadership phrases that have a lot of truth in them. But if they're keeping us from ever being the person who cleans the toilets, or sets up the chairs, or washes the dishes afterwards, or sits with that person who can't give us anything, they're not going to benefit us, they're not going to push our career forward, but they need our time, and we serve them by giving them our time. If we're not doing that, we're not living out John 13. Because this
Mm.
isn't about teaching, it's not about leadership, it's about washing feet, manure crusted, dirty,
Mm.
stinky, sandal covered feet. And we've got to find what the equivalent of that is today. That's what Jesus is calling us to.
I mean, obviously, this isn't easy stuff to do. This is probably one of there's different ways to love your neighbor, and probably this is the least fun and the hardest way. How Obviously, I don't think most of us are in dire situations where we're gonna die in 3 days or we're gonna die next tomorrow morning.
Right.
But in everyday to life, how do we look at Jesus and see what he did and then apply it to our lives?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, partially yesterday morning, I was digging in this passage again because I'm going, why do I keep failing at serving this week?
Mm.
Is there some fresh insight about what's going on with Jesus that'll help me do a better job of walking in his footsteps? And I saw a couple of things here. First of all, just straight out of the gate in verse 1, notice what it says. It was just before the Passover feast. Jesus knew that the time had come for him to leave this world and go to the Father. And there's this very clear sense in Jesus's mind right here that the end is coming,
Mm.
that he has a limited amount of time left to serve these particular disciples, these particular leaders. And you know what? That's true for all of us in some ways. As a parent of a 5-year-old, an 8-year-old, and a 14-year-old, it can feel like I'm going to be serving my kids forever. But any parent who's now an empty nester would be quick to remind me, no, your days of serving your kids in that, at least in that particular way, will go by so quickly. And there will come a day when Liz and I will go, gosh, I wish we could serve our kids in that way again.
Mm.
I won't always get to serve my wife. Someday one of us will pass into eternity and the other one will be left behind, and we will no longer get to serve each other in that way. We won't always get to serve our classmates or our coworkers. Life will move us on. And there's just something about going, no, I have a limited amount of time to serve this person.
Mm.
I want to do it well. That gives us a little bit of motivation.
Well, I think you're really talking about having a perspective,
Hmm.
like seeing
Yeah.
that. I mean, Jesus had perspective. Like
Mhm.
he recognized my time is short. It is coming. What can I do to help impact these people the most? And for him, it wasn't leadership. It wasn't teaching them how to run a Bible study. It was washing their feet.
Yeah.
Can you tell us what else John has to say about this?
Yeah, well, I think it's also interesting then in verse 1 because it continues and it says, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. And you mentioned just a minute ago that second commandment is love your neighbor as yourself, and this is one of the keys to loving.
Mm-hmm.
And it's possible. It's not the only element of love. Love is multifaceted, but if your love does not involve sacrificial service, it's not real love. And I guess I would even say if your love does not involve service that costs, it's not real love. Real love will always be defined. And Jesus says it later in this passage, right? Greater love is no man than this, that he lays down his life for his friends. So he defines love as dying to self. And this is one of the ways we die to ourselves. We die to ourselves by sacrificially serving, which is why it's such a great antidote to pride and power.
So you're saying basically to embrace the cost.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And look at the cost Jesus paid. I mean, we've already talked about this. Judas and Peter are in the room.
Mm.
And before he sends Judas out, which he does, right after this, Judas is gone. Jesus doesn't give Judas the rest of this teaching, but he makes sure he washes his feet before he goes. And that just when I'm too tired, when I feel like they don't deserve it, I don't have anything left to give. This reminder, hey, Jesus served Judas. That just gives a different perspective.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, it's really interesting. I there's a quote that is you know what type of how you serve based on how you're treated when you are treated like a servant.
Yeah.
And that it's it kind of has to do with embracing the cost, but it all of this is it's slightly a mindset
Mm.
and how you go into serve. Like you talked about being a martyr, embracing
Mm.
the cost. Like it's not just about going and doing the action. It's about doing the action with a servant's mind.
Mm.
Which is the next one is know your place.
Yeah, absolutely. And notice, thanks for that, Caleb. Notice what it says here in verse 3. It says, Jesus knew that the Father had put all things under his power and that he had come from God and was returning to God. Okay, that is such a powerful verse. I mean, it's just pregnant with meaning. Jesus knew that the Father had put all things under his power. He's got all power.
Mm.
None of us have that. He has that. And that he'd come from God and was returning to God. He knows where he's from. He knows where he's going. And we would expect the next verse to say, so, and then something about his power or his glory. I mean, he deserves all power, all glory. Scripture says that. But instead, verse 4 says, so he got up from the meal, took off his outer clothing, wrapped a towel around his waist, and served. And this is the opposite of how we so often think.
Mm.
Our world programs us to go, I'm the boss, I'm the parent, I'm the older sibling, I'm the one in seniority. And because that's true, I got to make sure I don't give away any of my power. I got to make sure I maintain my position. If I serve too much, they'll think I'm not the real deal. Or it's maybe sometimes just more selfish than that. I don't have to serve because I'm the guy in charge. I'm the woman in charge. And Jesus does the exact opposite. He knows that real power equals real service. And because he already had all the power and authority,
Mm.
he wouldn't lose anything by serving. In fact,
Mm.
because he already had all the power and authority, he could serve. That was his act of demonstrating his power and authority. And then, of course, within the next 24 hours, John will tell us Jesus goes to his ultimate glory, which is not the resurrection, it's the cross.
Mm.
And this is such an upside down picture of power and authority, such an upside down picture of what it means to have glory and honor and power. Sacrificial service. We'll talk, by the way, more next week about what this means to find your place in the Father. It says Jesus knew he had come from the Father and was returning to the Father, and then he's going to expand that theme to talk about us as the antidote to insecurity, which we're talking about next week. I'm really excited about that.
Great. Well, it's all really helpful, and not just on a practical level, but I mean, it is very practical, but also it's very reassuring to
Hmm.
know that Jesus understands that this tension that we're trying to face of knowing when to serve, but also knowing how to lead others, but serving by leading others we can serve.
Mhm.
And he gives a great example. It's also reassuring and it's very practical at the same time. So is there anything you would add to finish it off, or?
Well, I mean, let's just finish with Jesus's words at the end of this passage. So, picking up in verse 12, he says, when he'd finished washing their feet, he put on his clothes and returned to his place. Do you understand what I've done for you? He asked them. And sometimes I wonder, do we really understand what he's done in this passage? We are so good at talking ourselves out of this. So, well, I serve in this way. Well, it's not this, and do we really understand what he's done? And then he says, you call me teacher and Lord, and rightly so, for that is what I am.
Mm,
He's not giving away his position. He's not giving away his authority. He is teacher and Lord. And because of that, he says, now that I, verse 14, your Lord and teacher have washed your feet, you also should wash one another's feet. This is going to be the antidote when these 11 are tempted to argue over positions of authority. This is going to be the antidote. I mean, Christian ministries split all the time
mm,
because leaders can't get along.
mm.
This is going to be the antidote to that. Wash one another's feet. Then, verse 15, I've set you an example that you should do as I have done for you. This is quite clear. This isn't some symbol. When I was in university, it was popular to say, well, let's have, I went to a Bible college and it was, well, let's gather everybody together and wash their feet. And I always thought, no, no, that's a terrible idea because people wanted to use it symbolically and it was this like really special kind of kumbaya moment. I'm going, there's nothing symbolic about this story. There's nothing warm and fuzzy about this story.
Mm,
It's dirty, it's hard, it's gross. That's what we're supposed to imitate.
mm.
This get your hands dirty and serve the least of these type of service. And then here's what he says in verse 16 and 17. I tell you the truth, no servant is greater than his master, nor is a messenger greater than the one who sent him. In other words, if I've done it, you can do it.
Mm.
You're not greater than me. Now that you know these things, verse 17, you'll be blessed if you do them. And that's the hard truth out of this passage. It's not just a good idea,
Mm.
it's not just a symbol of something else. It's a concrete reality and the challenge to me is how do I find space in my life to serve those that are hard to serve? How do I find space in my life to serve my enemies? How do I find space in my life to serve the least of these? How do I find space in my life to serve those who will give me nothing back in return? They won't advance my career. They won't open up opportunities for me. They won't help me check something off my list. They just need the love of Jesus, and I need to find time in my life and space in my heart to serve them. That's what Jesus is pushing us towards in John 13.
Wow. It's very convicting, isn't it?
Absolutely. For me too.
Tell us just a bit about what we're looking at next week, though, so we have a bit of a sense
Yeah.
what we're looking at.
Well, next week we're taking on this antidote of insecurity. And insecurity is something we all wrestle with. We all struggle with. We call it imposter syndrome, call it whatever you want. I think this is one of those things that we all face and we don't think
Mm,
anybody else does. We
mm,
look around everybody else and they look confident. They look like they got it together. They look like they got it figured out. But meanwhile, inside, I'm falling to pieces. And this keeps us from leaning into so many opportunities God gives us. We go, who am I? What if I fail? Somebody else could say it better. Somebody else could do it better. And we're just back on our heels. We're not leaning into the opportunities God gives us. And our world tries to give us lots of options on that. Positive self-talk, build yourself up, you can do it. Jesus gives us something entirely different. He takes us deep into the heart of his Father and tells us, find your place in the Father, find your place in the God of the Trinity. And so it's incredibly practical, but incredibly rich. I can't wait to lean into that next time. Jesus has some brilliant answers for us on this issue of insecurity.
Well, thank you so much for joining us for the second episode, but the first one on the six temptations. I hope you will join us again for next week. We are so happy that you are listening, and make sure to tell others about it. Yeah.
Yeah, love it. If you're watching on YouTube, hit that subscribe button, share it with somebody else. We'd love to for more people to know about this. And if you don't have a copy of the Bible study this is all based on, please get in touch. Would love to share that with you, make that available to you in some way so that you can be following along through John 13 to 17 in this study. A lot of rich material there.
Great. Well, hope you have a good rest of your week or a good weekend, and we will see you soon. Bye.
Thanks.